Hi, my name's Hayden, and today we're going to be learning about CSS formatting. So far we've learned about the rules that we can use to apply CSS properties to particular elements based on selectors, but we haven't talked a lot about those properties themselves and what we can do with it, which means we haven't talked a lot about how we can actually make pages colorful and interesting and dynamic in terms of their visuals and aesthetics. Now, today we're not going to be covering everything you can do in terms of CSS formatting. We're going to be really focusing in on just text and background images. But that's okay because it should give you enough of a taste and a flavor for what you can do in your own time. Now, I mentioned text, so let's have a look at some text. Text is probably one of the most versatile elements of what you can tweak on a page because there's just a lot of variance, and we'll kind of just look at a really simple example. So let's make ourselves a span. We'll give it a class, say my text, and that can say hello. You know, maybe we'll add a few extra things in here. So for instance, inside of this span, maybe we'll add a paragraph, hello, how are you, like this. And then up the top, let's make ourselves a custom style and my text here. And we'll just start with a red color, so that text will have a red color, and I've got the page up here. So we've got hello, how are you? Now, I'm just gonna start launching off a bunch of different things you can do. You can make your font bold if you'd like, that's one obvious one. You can change the font family. That's like the font as you would in like Microsoft Word or Google Sheets or something like that. So it can be Arial. Now remember, these fonts are actually on your system computer. So these fonts, the web browser will actually talk to your operating system to see if that font exists. So it's not something that just kind of exists within Google Chrome or Edge or Firefox or something, Safari. It actually is on an individual computer. Now this is usually okay because nearly all computers have the same basic fonts, right? But it's much more relevant if you're using a more obscure font. And there's actually an entire lecture on fonts that you can go and look at where we talk about font sizes in a lot more detail and font families and everything else. So we won't go too far into fonts. But speaking of size, you can also change the font size. Now, previously you would have seen me do something like font size 200%. There are a few different ways that you can express font sizes. Again, go check out the fonts lecture. But in general, the way I'd probably recommend you do it is that 1em is the standard font size. And if you want your font to go bigger or smaller, you simply treat that as like as a factor. So for instance, 1.5 is 50% bigger than normal, and 0.5 is half as big as normal. And you can use that as a kind of general scale. I already mentioned that we have the color. You'll see a few more examples up on this slide include the font style, the text decoration. Again, some of these you might have seen before. So, you've got text decoration underline. That will make your text have a line underneath it. You got font style italic. So that's how you get your like kind of italic slanted text. We also have things like line height. So for instance, if you want your text, across many different lines to have extra height, you can do something like that. So now it's like got extra height, or you can make them even smaller. You could make them, 50% size or, 0% size, which is no gap between them. You can often make line height actually kind of creep up on itself. Similarly, you can do the same thing with letter spacing. So letter spacing could be 100% or 200% if you want it. Oh, not 200%. Let's look up letter spacing CSS. So letter spacing will have, it's probably in pixels. Yep, so letter spacing actually needs to be a certain number of pixels. So let's say you go like 0.3 pixels. That means it's going to try and put 3 pixels of space between each character. If you go like 0 pixels, you get normal. You can go -3 pixels or something like that. That's how you get text overlap. So occasionally you'll actually see websites where kind of text looks stylized like this. And they can just do that by playing around with letter spacing. Maybe you don't want it to be underlined, for instance, and you've just got something like this. Now this text here is really small. Maybe we'll make it a bit bigger. Maybe we'll make it something like that. That's also why you might have noticed, I don't know if you were paying attention, but when I did 3 pixels before, it looked like the gaps were really big. Like when I went from 3 to 5. And you might be thinking, gosh, some of those gaps look bigger than 3 pixels. Well, that was because I was zoomed in, because that's the actual size of the text here. So when we go -1 pixel, all it does is actually shift the characters just literally 1 pixel to the left. And -2, -3, now suddenly it starts to look quite tight and cute. So that's just some basic examples. There's really not a lot to text. Generally, a lot of what you'll be doing is color, size, and font weight. There's a lot more than that, but won't go into it. Probably a more fun one is playing around with background image. Background image is something you'll generally apply on divs. So if I have a div down here, and I'll give that div a class of like, you know, my pick or something. You know, we've kind of explored previously how you can use CSS to, I'll leave that alone for now, but like how you can use HTML to include an image. So like, let's say I look up, you know, mini rabbit, or yeah, what's a cute tiny rabbit? Yeah. So let's say we got like a tiny rabbit like this. Then you've probably seen previously that, you know, we can do something like, say, image source, and we can paste that image in, and, you know, there's our image of the rabbit. It's now on the page, and we can play around with, say, you know, the width is 400 and make it a little bit smaller like that. But a really common thing you might want to do is not actually just put that image of the rabbit on the page, but you'll actually want to kind of use that image as a background for some text. So let's imagine here that I have this div, and I'm like, even better, you know what, let's take this text and let's put this text inside the div. So now we've got this div down here, and let's play around with some of the div's properties. So maybe the div wants to have a width of 300 pixels. Maybe it wants to have a height of 300 pixels. Maybe it wants to have a background color of green. That's going to look really bad. That looks horrifying. Get rid of that line height thing. There we go. So I can't even look at that. Maybe let's try blue, something that doesn't, that's manageable. So let's say we've got this div here, but like background color is already a whole new property that I mentioned, but let's say you want something else, like you actually want a background image. Well, you can actually give it a background image by passing in a URL to that background image property, and now instead of being blue, it's actually going to be a rabbit. But we need to play around with these background image properties, because as you can see here, the rabbit kind of, like, what's wrong with this background image? What's actually wrong is that all background images will try and display at their natural size unless you specify otherwise. So for instance here, I actually need to now say that the background size is, and you think, oh, I don't know what background size should be. So I Google it. It's like background size CSS. And we'll find out just from a quick Google that, I know how to do this, right? But it's like, they'll show you, it's like the two value syntax. The first value is the width of the image. The second value is the height. Okay, so let's say I want the background to be 400 pixels by 300 pixels. And it's like, okay, well, there's the rabbit. Now, obviously, my actual background is 300 by 300, so I might need to do something like that. Or I need, sorry, my actual div, or I might need to change the div. So maybe the div, I'll make it 400 pixels, and I'll make the background image 300 pixels like that. So now I've got this kind of cute little rabbit backgroundy thing like this. We can do more with this, but we'll kind of discuss that in another lecture in terms of layout. But I just want to show you, a lot of this stuff keeps going deeper and deeper. Let's imagine that the background image size is only, say, 200 by 100. What's going to happen? It's actually going to repeat itself like this. Well, how do I tell it how to not repeat? I go background repeat, and I write no repeat like this. And now it won't repeat. Or I can say repeat Y, which will repeat things vertically, or I can say repeat X, which will repeat things horizontally, or I can just say repeat, which will repeat things always, or I could change my background size to be, 100%, 50%, which will kind of give it a funny look. You can really do quite a lot of different things with it. And, a lot of formatting properties, and we'll see this in future, actually have these kinds of compound definitions, where instead of writing things out like this, where I'm like background image, background size, background repeat, I can actually write out a shorthand version of it, where I'll say like, actually, you know what? The background is that URL, no repeat, 100%, 50%. Now I might have the ordering of this wrong. Let's see if I do. Yeah, I do have that slightly wrong. There's a particular order that you need to follow. That order you can find just by like CSS background. So if you say, go look up the actual docs, it'll show you, there you go. It's like, where is it? Background green. Yeah, so you can see how it's like background is URL, then repeat Y. So you need to kind of get these things right. In this particular case, for instance, we might just say, you know, the background is 30%. If you have a kind of, there you go, 30%, 20%, you see these have different kind of effects. But if you actually pay attention, I haven't got this right here. You notice that the image isn't actually getting bigger and smaller. It's actually moving across because one of the other properties that we haven't explored, like let's say we start this at 100%, is that you can actually move the background position. Because obviously this image of the rabbit right now extends way beyond the frame. But if I say create a background position of 10 pixels, 10 pixels, what that actually does is it offsets the position. So like every background image starts at 0, 0 up in the top left. And when you say 10 pixels, 10 pixels, it kind of shifts it 10 pixels in and then 10 pixels down. And you do all kinds of crazy things with this. For instance, you might think, oh, well, that's kind of useless, but you can actually go to negative pixels here. So I could actually start moving the image across. And I could start being super creepy by like making it negative 500, negative 500. And I'm like, oh, that's cute. That's the rabbit. Can I make it negative 600? Maybe bring it in a bit, and then maybe make this negative 400 to bring it down. There you go. That's a cute background. So the actual background property expects something more like this. That's like the kind of compound property here. So it's like the URL, the repeat, the background position. And you'll see a lot of these compound properties have really specific expectations in terms of like the ordering you pass things in. And again, we'll explore a few more of these as we go on. I think font actually has a similar one. So if you look up CSS font, the font property, typically you'll see that similar thing here. Like in this case, it's specifying italic, small caps, bold, the font size, the font family. That's another example of these. I don't think they're called compound properties. I just call them compound properties. Yeah, so the font property is a shorthand property for the style, variant, weight, size, family. So all that information is really there. So if you're like, I don't know how to do it, you could just come here and be like, okay, well, style is italic, variant I don't have, weight is bold, size is 2em, family is Arial. Okay, there's my font. And now that will behave like that. So that's certainly very useful. Another case that you'll see this is for border. So for instance, you have border width might be a pixel, border style might be solid, and border color might be black, like this. So you see you got this nice little black border there. Obviously I could make the border much thicker. I could make the border, instead of solid, I could make it dashed, which is like little lines. I could also make it dotted if I want to, like this. But there's a shorthand property as well, which is width, style, color, 3 pixels, dotted, black, like that. So border, background, these are all like nice ways to kind of add style to your divs. There's a few other fun ones, like for instance, everything has a box shadow. A box shadow takes in 4 properties typically, which is like, if you imagine there's an element, there's like a shadow behind it, that shadow is going to have a certain X offset, a certain Y offset, and then it's going to have a certain spread of the shadow, they call it, and then it's going to have a color of the shadow. So for instance, let's say I do 0, 0, 5 pixels black for a black shadow. Let's have a look at how this turns out. Now you can actually see that little slight shadow there. So the 0, 0 means the shadow is right in the middle. But you'll see if I come down here and I go, say 10 pixel, 10 pixel, that's now 10 pixel across 10 pixel down. The shadow's now down there. And this 5 here is kind of how, when you like have a flashlight or a torch, and you like, as you pull it further away, the torch gets weaker, but it spreads out like the light. Whereas when you bring it really close, it's like really tight and it nearly looks just like a solid shape. It's kind of the same thing here. So if I go to 15 pixels, you'll see that the shadow's bigger, but it's more spread out. And if I do something big, like say 35 pixels, it's like a super spread out shadow. And similarly, I could move the shadow kind of up into the top left by going negative when it comes to the spacing. So now it kind of looks like the image is coming out this way off the page. So lots and lots of ways you can configure that. These are all different types of Formatting, obviously, you could also actually do things like you could set the color here. We've previously talked about inheritance, so you don't need to have the text be red. You could actually just have the pick be blue, and all of the text inside of it will inherit that property, for instance, if you'd like to. So that's just some basics of the background image. We covered position, size, repeat, image. You know, here you go. You've also got other, like for the background size, you don't have to specify percentages like I did. You can also specify with keywords like contain and cover. So like contain will scale the image to fit the element, cover will scale the image as large as possible and crop the overflow part. So that's really useful. So let's say we come back here and we're like, well, okay, that was the size, that was the position we had. Can we add contain here? Okay, well, let's try and do that separately. Background, what was it? Background position size? Was it position or size? It was size. Okay. Background size is contain. There we go. Let's maybe try and get rid of the position. There you go. So that's what contain does, is it tries to stretch the image out there. And then we got cover, which, so remember, contain will try and kind of fill it, but include the whole image, and cover will try and remove all of, make sure everything's covered, and it will crop it slightly. So that's a really nice shorthand way. And you'll often see this with CSS, like you're going to learn a bunch of CSS now, but what CSS can do in 5 years is very different. So in the past, for instance, contain and cover didn't exist. They were added in because people realized that there were tons of developers who were constantly having to like figure out what percent, you know, it's just like we were doing before where we're like, oh, we got to make it 400 by 300. So cover's really nice. It just kind of plops it in there. And you'll see what happens with cover. If I make the height 200, it will just kind of keep doing very smart things for me. If I make it 500, it'll grow the size of the image. That wouldn't happen with what I had previously, for instance. So that's really helpful and interesting. We did talk about background position already, but we mainly talked about background position when it came to, like we had before, it was -500. Background position is mostly relevant when you have a background that's smaller than the element itself. So for instance, let's say that I have a background size of 50 pixels by 50 pixels. So this little rabbit's going to be really tiny. The background position, which we were playing with before with percentages, right? We were like -500 pixels and stuff like this. The background position, you could also say, is just like top center or something, which will put it in the top, or the center, or the center right. And this is really important because, you know, for every CSS property, like, you know, CSS background position, you will find that there is a whole bunch of different values you can have. And quite often the values aren't just all left, right. There's many different ways that you can express those values. So you can just say top, bottom, left, right, or you can say percentage values as to like how percent in should you move it, or you can give it absolute things in centimeters or EM or pixels. Or you can be super specific and say, I want it to be 10 pixels from the bottom and 20 pixels from the right. You know, there's just lots and lots of different ways you can express things. So these docs are really important to read if you want it. But most of the time, you'll probably find a way of expressing yourself that's pretty okay, and you'll just get used to that. For instance, you know, pixels or percentage. And it really depends on what problem you're trying to solve at the time. But this gives you like a really quick kind of overview of some CSS formatting properties. Again, there's a lot more. You can just go and like look up CSS properties and you will see an absolute mountain of them. And it's important to look at the docs too, because not all of these properties apply to all of the elements, right? In fact, there's a ton here that don't really apply to a lot of things. And we're going to go through more in future lectures, but you see you've got things like letter spacing, line height, we covered those. List style type, that's to do with unordered lists and stuff. So you can go and change the list style for unordered lists. Margins we're going to talk about in the layout lectures. Outline color, outline width. We've also got overflow X, which is essentially what do you do if your text flows too far over the side and horizontally, or overflow Y, because sometimes you'll have divs or spans that are a certain size, but the text that's entered gets too large. Do you cut it off? Do you use ... dots? Like there's a lot you can decide on there. Position, lots of layout stuff. Text, there's a lot of text here. Text underline position, you can move the position of the underline. For instance, you know, we talked about that text decoration. There's text shadows. So we can add shadows to text too if we'd like. There you go, that's a cute shadow, right? So we look at an example. Where do they have the code for it? CSS. Well, it's very complicated, isn't it? So, you know, say we take this one and we say, well, we want my blue text to have that kind of text shadow. Whoa, that's very retro, isn't it? Right, so this is just a whole bunch of shadows all layered. So it's demonstrating here that you can actually layer shadows. And then you think, oh my God, does that mean I can layer shadows elsewhere? I can have like a yellow shadow on my box as well. And it's like, yeah, wow, you can actually have like these interesting yellow and black shadows. So I've got like a black shadow up in the top left and then a yellow shadow down in the top right. And it's like, oh, wow. It's just like a bottomless pit, you know? There's things you learn every single day and you'll never stop learning. Unless your full-time job for years is going to be CSS, you'll always be uncovering new things. So let's put a halt there. You can format many things in many beautiful ways and many unbeautiful ways. All you need to do is a quick Google, bit of experimenting, and, you know, sky's the limit. Hi, sorry for the abrupt cut, but there's one more thing we have to talk about before we wrap up, which is color. So far, everything we've been doing with color looks like this. It's been saying background green, and we've just been using words to describe the color. But there are other common ways that we describe color. One of the obvious ones is the RGB. RGB is where we give it 3 different values from 0 to 255 that represent the red, green, and blue color. For instance, we might say we want 200 red, 100 green, 0 blue. The higher the number is, up to 255, the more kind of potent it is. So this means like really red, kind of green, not blue. And what happens when you get really red and kind of green? You get this kind of like funny orangey color like this. The other way to describe backgrounds is by using a hex code. And a hex code is actually the exact same thing as RGB. It's just represented as hex. So if you were to ask yourself, okay, what's the hex for 200? It'll say C8. So, you go right C8. And then you say, what's the hex for 100? Well, it's going to be like 64, obviously, and then 000. So these two things are actually completely identical and just slightly different ways of representing colors. So that's the same color. Now, you might be thinking, wait. That was quite a big jump from, black, white, purple to like all these crazy codes. The good thing is you don't really have to worry about figuring out what they are because you can just go online and use color pickers. Color pickers are tools like this where, and they're you Google a million of them. They're in like lots of different websites. You can just kind of find a color like that and be like, that's a nice color. And then when you click on it, it'll show you that's the hex code, that's the RGB code. There's more things you can do, like hue, saturation, lightness, I think that is. So you're like, yep, that's a nice color. And then I come along here and then I'm like, oh, cool, there you go, done. That's the color I want. So if you don't want these kind of stock standard blue, black, purple, green, yellow, you can go and actually use one of these many, 255 to the power of 3 colors that exist. So go play around. Lots on Google, never going to be hard to find, but hopefully that makes things a little bit more fun. And thank you. Hopefully you've learned a lot about formatting today.